Dahlia SCHEINDLIN is a political analyst and pollster who joins me now live from Tel Aviv. Dahlia, thanks for taking the time to speak to us here on France 24. What do you read into these results? Can we now say without a doubt at this point that Benjamin Netanyahu will again become Israel's prime minister?
It seems like very likely at this point. He either, at the present count, which is about 85% of the votes, the bloc of parties supporting Netanyahu have 65 seats. There is still a chance. It's very hard to say if it's a small or a big chance. It doesn't look like a big chance, but a significant chance that one smaller party in the bloc of parties opposed to Netanyahu might still pass the electoral threshold of 3.25%. In that case, Netanyahu could go down to 61 seats, but that's still a majority out of 120 seats in parliament. It looks like he is on track to form the next government. And the main question is whether it will be a very narrow majority of 61 seats or a more firm majority of 65 seats.
Regardless, it does seem like a lot of Israelis did decide to vote to the right. How do you explain that? Where does this lurch to the right, if we can call it that, come from?
Well, it really isn't a lurch. I mean, these have been the dynamics in the Israeli public for many, many years. And in fact, if you think that it's 65 seats out of 120, which looks like 52% or so, it's actually much more than that, because there are parties that are ideologically right-wing and right-wing in their policy that simply have not gone into the parties, the bloc of parties that support Netanyahu. So they are not supporting him to be prime minister with Likud because he's under indictment, but they still hold right-wing ideology. And by that count, we're looking at well over 70 seats out of 120. This is not something that happened overnight. The Israeli public has been defining itself as right-wing, at least certainly at around 50% for much of the last, let's say, 10 years or more. But it went over 50% recently, and that right-wing ideology is driven by the Jewish section of society or sector. It's the majority, of course. We're talking about 76% of the Israeli adult population. And those voters are about 64% self-identified as right-wing. This has been a process in place for years. Why are they right-wing? Well, there's a self-reinforcing dynamic because Netanyahu and the Likud have been in power during the 12 years from 2009 to 2021, and they led with very right-wing coalitions. They nurtured and cultivated populist, nationalist, right-wing forces that legitimized very strong nationalism, very strong anti-Arab sentiment, very illiberal values, and tried to enact policies that would intimidate civil society and political dissent. They haven't actually been able to pass many of those policies, but they've created an environment where people who are critical of the government, its policies, or the state of Israel, or don't support the policies they support for continuing to expand, for example, Israel's control over the Palestinians, anyone who doesn't support that has been portrayed as somehow not included, as even as bad as a traitor in this environment. And so that has been self-reinforcing for the last 12 years. Certainly not a surprise that there's a majority for right-wing parties. What does seem to be more of a surprise is that all of the parties supporting Netanyahu, which were unable to get a majority in 4 previous election cycles, seem to have gotten the majority, whether it's small or large majority.
So what kind of effect might that have on the next government?
Well, it looks on track to be a very right-wing government with Netanyahu and his parties, who are the party to his right, which is a very nationalist, really a Jewish supremacist party called Religious Zionism, and 2 ultra-Orthodox religious parties, which would be very much in agreement with one another about deepening the theocratic nature of Israeli society, which has called itself a democracy and tries to portray that sometimes. But when you have such a heavy encroachment of religious dominance over public life, and that government would be expected to make that more so, it becomes harder to see society as civic democracy. On the other hand, these are parties that have become increasingly committed to undermining democratic institutions, particularly the rule of law. They have taken aim at the Supreme Court and other branches of the legal system. They do not want constraints on government power. So this is not only about increasing impact of religion on public life, it is about decreasing the capacity of checks and balances on the power they would have, the power of the government, the power of the majority. They all share a very committed ideological commitment to Israel maintaining permanent control over Palestinians in the West Bank and effective control over Gaza.
Just a last question, Dahlia, on where does this now leave the left? And just a quick word on the Arab minority vote.
Yeah, well, let's start with the Arab minority vote. Palestinian citizens of Israel who have the right to vote have been erratic in their turnout patterns over the last number of cycles, reflecting a very strong degree of alienation from the political system and the sense that their vote may not be sufficiently effective, and disappointment in the Jewish leadership for that reason, and in the Arab leadership for poor political decisions that they've made along the way. There was a high anticipation that their vote, based on surveys throughout the campaign cycle, would be very low, in the mid 40% range, low 40% range, even as low as 1/3. Really low participation. However, on election day, it looks like their turnout went up, exceeding expectations, reaching nearly half, possibly over half by the time all of the votes are counted, which did contribute to at least two of the parties that represent them crossing the electoral threshold of 3.25%. The third party that many of them have voted for doesn't look like it's likely to get in, although it apparently earned a much better showing than it was expected to. It came close to the electoral threshold, but with 85% of the votes counted, it looks like it probably didn't get in. If that party were to have gotten in, it would have significantly shifted the balance and probably made it almost Netanyahu's supporting bloc would have lost its majority. In terms of the left, of course, there will still be a constituency of people, a group of, community of Israelis who are committed to liberal democratic values, ending the occupation, reaching some sort of a negotiated political resolution with the Palestinians, and who do not wish to perpetuate Israel's control over Palestinians, which robs them of their right to self-determination in the perspective of the left. That community, however, is small. It represents not even 20% of the total electorate. Among the Jewish electorate or the Jewish community, it represents between 11 and 12%, maybe as high as 14%. And I have to put the focus on the Jewish community because the Arab voters are turning out only at about half their strength. And therefore, the total number of people who vote reflects much more strongly the division of opinions within the Jewish community.
Dahlia, thank you for that. Dahlia SCHEINDLIN, they're speaking to me live from Tel Aviv. Thank you.